Albert Lee Seed is proud to support the Back to the Roots podcast. Like you, they value the one-on-one conversations with farmers and other agricultural professionals that you hear on this show. Albert Lee Seed helps organic and transitional farms with a full line of organic and non-GMO farm seed for corn, soybeans, forage and pasture, cover crops, and cereal grains. Check them out at alseed.com. That's alseed.com.
You're listening to Back to the Roots podcast. I'm Mike Klein, and today, along with Brian Wood, we're sitting down with Jim Jarman, who is the Vice President of Sales at Organic Valley, and we're doing something a little bit different today. We're going to talk about sales and the marketplace. So, Jim, thank you so much for joining us.
Sure, glad to be here. And how much am I allowed to crack jokes or make fun of things that happen here? 100%, 90%, 80%. I can't go below 80.
We're good with 90 to 100.
Okay. Great. Well, I'll talk a little bit about just my background to kind of frame it in. I've been in Organic Valley now for the last 2 years, but my background is more broadly in food. After grad school, I was at Ecolab. I was working for a couple years in their North American business in the hospitality side, but then spent 5 years working in the international side in the beverage and brewing space first, leading the marketing efforts for our Bev and Brew business for Asia and Latin America, and then transitioning over to all of our food and beverage platform for China, India, and Southeast Asia. And that was really where I started to get to know dairy in a more meaningful way on the processing side. Spent a lot of time in dairy plants all over China and other places in Asia. Went to Cargill, which was one of our biggest customers there in the food ingredient side. And that eventually led me to Land O'Lakes, where I thought I knew a little about dairy before I got there. And I realized I didn't know anything about dairy and understood what it was like to work for a farmer-owned co-op and to work in a part of their business that was really about creating balance and creating total value for our membership base. So I came in to lead the marketing organization and then eventually transitioned over to leading parts of the sales organization, innovation team, et cetera. So became really a dairy person at that point, and then took a few years outside of dairy, went to a Danish equipment company where I ran the marketing side for their North and South America businesses. And then after 3 years came back to food. So I've been at Organic Valley since then. Came in to lead our ingredients business here, and then I'm now taking on a broader role leading our ingredients business, private label, food service, e-commerce, and then all of our international business on the retail side as well as the ingredient side. So pretty broad background across food and food production.
Do you have an ag background? It sounds like you worked a lot with agriculture, but did you come from an ag background at all?
So I grew up on a hobby farm in Alabama. My parents had moved down there not too long before I was born. The farm we grew up on, we grew or hunted probably 90% of everything we ate at the house until I was around middle school when my mom went back to work. We had a garden that was over an acre. We had every different kind of animal you can imagine. My dad loved to hunt, so we always had 2 freezers full of meat and a root cellar full of vegetables that we canned. And as a kid, that was significantly not cool. When I wanted to just go play Nintendo with my friends, and my dad saying things like, "Let me show you how we, take a carburetor apart." So I learned a lot of things that I wasn't as interested in that I realized later on actually had some pretty good value. So my dad and my brother and I actually built the house that my parents then lived in, and we lived in when I was in high school at that point. So, I learned a lot there that I never thought was intentional. And then as I became a homeowner later, I realized, again, there's a lot of things that I learned that turned out to be really valuable. But it was it was a personal farm. It was not a commercial farm. So pretty different, but we loved it. Growing up, I never thought of myself as being, pursuing an agricultural approach or a food background. It just turned out. I got halfway through my career and I'm like, hey, it seems like I've been doing a lot of things in food. And turns out I'm a food person. My background as it relates to agriculture commercially had a lot to do with really the sustainability sides of things that I was working on. When I first came, when I was in grad school, I spent time studying in Costa Rica. I spent time studying in Belgium and in Europe. And a lot of that was focused on sustainable development and how do companies use the power of businesses to create more economically environmentally and socially sustainable platform. So I was really involved with Net Impact. It's a nonprofit that focuses on how to use business for social good, and helped with a couple of my friends create the Net Impact professional chapter in Minneapolis. So I was a founding board member there. And this was always kind of critical and important to like what I did. When I was at Ecolab, I was really lucky when I first got there. They were really making a push to tell their story more about sustainability. And they said, hey, you've spent a lot of time in this space. We want you to take this on. Can you do this kind of on the side? And so I had my day job, which was kind of the regular kind of marketing, intro career stuff. And my side job was essentially, how do we tell the story of all the sustainability initiatives we're driving? And then that transitioned to how do we become even more sustainable in how we operate? And that transitioned into speaking at events all over the country and in places sometimes around the world on the work that Ecolab was doing to create more sustainable impacts, primarily around water reduction, energy reduction. And then when I came to Cargill, as an example, that started to go to the food side. Well, what are we doing on the food side to have a more sustainable impact? And I was lucky throughout my entire career that I was always able to weave that into what I was working on. And so I think about it not so much just in agriculture, but in food production in general. That's a field that is heavily water dependent, and how folks use water, especially in parts of the world where you don't have a lot of water, can have major, major impact. And so I really would have probably thought of it more that way, more than just specifically about agriculture. I would thought more on the food processing. And Organic Valley gave me a chance to really tie a lot of the passions that I have around how businesses operate for, again, social impact, and to make it just part of what I did every day. And so here that does have an agricultural bent, but it also has impact in our processing facilities, et cetera. So it's a really nice way to tie together things that I've done professionally, have been good at, as well as what I care about and am passionate about, and how I want to have an impact on the world that we live in.
So I heard you talk a lot about the marketing that you've worked in your career. What is the relationship between the marketing side and then now being on the sales side? Is that kind of one and the same? How does that tie together? Because there's always this push and pull with marketing and sales. They're never quite in agreement with each other. Is that fair to say?
I think it's fair to say, and actually you don't want people to be in total agreement. I think that it's really important to have what I call a creative tension and a constructive tension, and that's within multiple parts of your cross-functional teams. If you have everyone 100% saying the same thing, you're not challenging each other enough. You're probably not going to get to the best and most creative and most optimal solution if everyone just goes, yeah, I like that idea, let's just all go do that one thing. So I think that at the end of the day, you certainly want to be marching down the same path, and you want to be doing it in alignments, and you want to be doing it collaboratively. But if everyone just says the same thing, you're not going to get to the best place. So I agree that they're not always 100% on the same page, but I don't think that they should be. I think that that's important to have that ability to have a constructive tension. And I was driving it from the marketing side for most of my career. And it was really, I think at Ecolab, a normal part of the process that marketing and sales were connected at the hip. And so especially in the last 5 years when I was on the international side of that business, I was on sales calls all over the world in a lot of different industries, and it would always be my corporate account salesperson, me on the marketing side, and I'd have a technical resource there. So you had a three-person team that would tackle all these major initiatives, because we were working with the largest food and beverage companies in the world on some of the most challenging problems to tackle, and how do we solve it. So we had the salesperson who was generally responsible for understanding the customer and their needs inside and out, the marketing person who's responsible for understanding the marketplace, the technology, how it applies, what the value that you can create is going to be. And then the technical person would be the person who understands, like, how do I actually make it work? How do I take that concept, that idea, and turn it into a product that has merit for customers? So one of the things that we did at Ecolab that I was always really excited about was they have a product called DryX. It's a lubrication product that works in a bottling process. So typically to keep bottles moving down the line, they use lubricants, and it's generally water-based would be the old way. DryX became a non-silicone based technology to reduce the water by over 95%. So you've got these bottling plants that use tons and tons and tons of water, and a lot of them are operating in places where they don't have a lot of water. So if you can reduce that water consumption by 95%, big deal. So you have a technical resource to tell the story of how it actually works. The salesperson, again, who knows the story of the customer, what they're trying to accomplish, and the marketing person understands, like, how do we create value for everybody involved so that it's economically valuable for us as a producer and it's economically valuable for that customer to be reducing that amount of water. So I think it's normal to have that kind of collaborative approach, but again, that doesn't mean that everybody has to say the same thing all the time. We have to push each other and challenge each other. So I came up through the marketing world that way, where it was just very normal to be working, hand in hand with sales. And that kind of transitioned throughout my whole career. I kept that approach, and that would be the same at Land O'Lakes, where it would be the first place where I started to take over sales organizations as well and run that part of the business. So it just became a kind of natural progression. So even in a general management type role there, I was always a marketing person first, who then became a sales leader and a general manager. But it was always kind of like marketing as the center of that. And when I came to Organic Valley, that was the first time when I came in first to the sales side of the business. And it was really kind of an eye-opener to me to see, like, when people go, oh, you're a salesperson, therefore I know these things about you. And the assumptions that kind of went with that was really interesting, because I'm like, oh, I wonder, like, did I do the same thing? When I was in the marketing side of the world, did I see a salesperson and go, okay, I think I already know who you are. I framed you up. And does it work kind of the same way in both directions? So pretty interesting. So at Organic Valley, we don't have a business unit structure, and that's a common thing in a lot of business, but it's in ours, we are more functionally aligned. And so in my old world, we would have normally had, all the marketing and sales for a particular business that report up to that. Here, it's just done functionally. So it's just a different way of aligning resources. But at the end of the day, you still have to make sure that you're working together with your partners across different parts of the business to drive an outcome that's good for your ownership. And in this case, that happens to be the members at Organic Valley. It's good for the company or the co-op itself, and it's good for customers. If you're not creating value for customers, none of it matters. You don't really have a license to play if you can't create value for customers. So yeah, I think, there's tension, and there's supposed to be. Same with R&D, same with supply chain. Now, if that tension becomes destructive instead of constructive, then you're in trouble. Mm-hmm. But you want that tension. You want it to be like a little push and pull. You want to challenge each other to get to the best outcome.
Now, before we go in, because I think where we wanted to go was like down the organic marketplace kind of overview. But before we go into that, you worked at Land O'Lakes. Very different than a story that's being told by a Organic Valley type company, I assume. It's in a conventional industry. I'd never worked in the conventional industry, but a lot of large farms, I assume, large volumes of milk. You're working on small margins, and correct me if I'm wrong on any of this, but how do you create that value for a customer or get any value for the farmers when you're in that tight of a marketplace?
Sure. I mean, great question. I think that when I came to Organic Valley, I was surprised at how many people had a lot of assumptions about what Land O'Lakes must have been like. They said, we're an organic co-op, they're not an organic co-op. That must mean X, Y, or Z.
Like I just did?
Yeah, that's
pretty much, Brian. Yep.
Well, I think this is really normal, right? And I think that like my friends at Land O'Lakes would probably be like, oh my gosh, you're working for that hippie organic co-op. And they have some assumptions about what that means also, right? And so I think it's normal for people to make assumptions. Of course, that happens. But I think it's interesting to me to kind of like juxtapose the two and figure out, like, well, where are they similar? Where are they different? And so, I talk about, like, what is the story of what we do, and we have to make sure our story is different. If it's not different, then we're probably not doing a good enough job of telling it, because the two organizations are in fact quite different. But there are tons of similarities. I mean, they're a farmer-owned co-op, member-owned co-op, because they have three different pieces of their organization. They have a dairy side, they have an animal nutrition side in the Purina brand, and then they have the Winfield side, which is the agricultural input business. And so in the Purina business for feed, their members there are largely like regional feed co-ops. So it's not a farmer member, it's a co-op or regional feed co-op member. So you have different kinds of members, but the board of directors there is elected by their members the same way. It's elected from those same organizations. So in that way, it's pretty similar. It is different there that it's a proportional voting. So if the bigger your farm, the more kind of weight your vote has, and that's different than the way that Organic Valley would do it on a one farmer, one vote, one member, one vote kind of scenario. but their membership is made up of their board of directors is made up of their membership, similar to here. And if you look at, I'll just talk about the dairy piece because that's where I think the similarities are kind of the most. If you look at their regions of the country, there are some parts that look a lot like OV and some parts that look really different. You know, the average size of the herd, at least at the time I was there, these numbers might be a little dated now. The average size of the herd, if you were in the east region for them, like kind of Pennsylvania, Ohio, was about 75 cows, which is what Organic Valley does. If you looked in the Midwest, sort of Wisconsin, Minnesota, the Dakotas, that would have been around 350 to 450. And if you're out on the West Coast, that would have been a couple thousand. So very different size farms, different structures, and that's kind of mirrors the industry, the dairy industry in total in some of those places. But I would always go back to this idea that in Pennsylvania, in that part of the country, that Land O'Lakes could tell a story to say, look at the 75 cow farms that we have. A lot of Amish farmers that are out there as well, similar to what Organic Valley has in certain regions. So if you were just buying milk in that region, so we would serve customers that would be regionally located there, Land O'Lakes could tell a story that looked a lot like the Organic Valley story. And when I would come to OV and say, if our story sounds like their story, we're not doing a good enough job of telling our story because Organic Valley is quite different than Land O'Lakes. And so we really have to figure out, well, where are we different, and how does that work? And that's specific to OV. But I think every company has to kind of figure out, well, what's your value proposition? What is the thing that makes you different than anybody else that's in the marketplace? And I know what that story looks like for OV, but every company has to figure it out. Our competitors should know why they are different than us. They should be able to tell a story that separates them from us. And if they can't, they're probably not doing a very good job of that. The same way, any company would have to do that. But yeah, I think that at Land O'Lakes, part of the challenge that they're trying to solve is they are they take a pretty asset-based approach to solving, to creating value for their member milk. So when I say that, what I mean is they have a certain number of plants that make a certain set type of products, and their goal is to run that plant as full as possible, drive the maximum efficiency of that particular type of product, and then that's through the creation of that product at the lowest possible cost. They're able to generate value back out to the customer. Organic Valley's approach is pretty different, and not just for us, but other folks who look like OV would be in this, be able to take a different approach to say, instead of just saying, I need to run one thing really fast, really hard, and just make one product, we take an approach where we say we work with lots of different co-manufacturing plants, between 60 and 90 over the course of a year to make lots of different kind of products. We don't have to run one asset full. So if the consumer demand changes for a certain type of product, we can shift away from something where the demand is shrinking into something where the demand is growing, and we aren't stuck with an asset that drives our decision. If we owned a plant that all they did was make blue cheese, that'd be a pretty weird plant to have if it was organic. There would not be a lot of growth opportunity maybe for that kind of plant. But we can work with some of the best blue cheese makers in the country to develop the OV blue cheese that's going to be killer, but we can use that plant to make the exact amount we need and not have to worry about driving efficiency of running that plant. On the flip side of it, if you're an asset-based organization, you need to make that plant, whatever they do, super fast, super hard, and then you just drive the most efficiency out of it. So you don't have as much flexibility in saying, well, where is a consumer demand going? Are consumers looking for something else? Because you're tied to the asset. It's really, really expensive to let that asset not be running full to go do something else. So it's not that it's a better or a worse approach. It's just one has different kinds of limitations. One has more flexibility. But then their efficiency is a lot higher than our efficiency might be in a co-manufacturing plant where we might just run a little bit of blue cheese in that facility. So it's all trade-offs. You kind of pick what is going to be your calling card. What's the thing that you do to create value, and then you play that that hand as well as you can.
Well, and I would say in the organic world, for a company like Organic Valley, it wasn't necessarily being able to move fast. That might be part of it. But for a long time, the value proposition was simply organic. Mm-hmm. And these days, that is quickly going away, just due to size of farms and competition and tight market. And you can get into all this stuff. But where is the value proposition these days when organic is, and especially and we're talking trying to keep small farms, and when that is what drove a Land O'Lakes to have the large, and I'm generalizing here again, but to have the size of farms that they did was efficiencies. and to fill their plants at the cheapest cost that they could and max run.
And Brian, this goes back to our conversation with Wendell Berry. And we talked about this earlier tonight. You know, the word efficiency is what drove factory farming and big ag, was efficiencies. And that's a real thing that we have to deal with, because efficiencies drive the market. I mean, you can't, when you talk about the size of the farms that we have within Organic Valley, and you look at the 15,000 cow dairy, you can't compete on efficiencies. You've got to tell the story.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. So to come back to the Land O'Lakes piece for a second, you're absolutely right. And they want to drive efficiency. They want to drive that plant full. At the same time, they're trying to figure out, like, how do they create the highest value for their membership, the same way that OV or any other co-op would be, or any other company with any kind of ownership structure. They want to figure out the highest amount of value that they can create. And so they locked in on a model that said, our model is about efficiency of that plant. And so they still want to have the highest pay price to their farmers that they can, which is not different than most other dairy co-ops. But to say, okay, our play is about efficiency when we own the asset. We're going to own that asset and we're going to run the heck out of it. You know, OV's calling card might have been a lot more about flexibility and the ability to offer a variety of things, right? So, you know, when you think about Land O'Lakes, what do you think about? What's the first thing that comes to mind? From
butter.
A product perspective, butter. Everyone knows butter. And it's incredible. They're the number one butter brand in the country by far. They're about 4 times larger than this number 2 butter company. That's their story. But they also do a lot of other stuff. They have a huge cheese business. Especially on the East Coast. They have their deli cheese business is phenomenal, and that's another giant chunk of what they do. But if you're not into the deli cheese market, like East Coast, some specific places, kind of the Mid-Atlantic, have this carryover, you might not even ever know that. But that's a huge part of their business. So, they said these are 2 or 3 things that we're going to be really, really good at. You know, Organic Valley, our story is different. Not that we're not really good at some things, but of course we are. But our story is also a lot more about variety. If you talk about a consumer perspective, you know, if you go to where we grew up, where do we build our business was through the natural class of trade. And so in that space, we still have a really dominant position. We are the number 1 organic brand of any kind, whether it's dairy or anything else. There's no other organic brand that's bigger than Organic Valley. And that's great that we can see that in the data. But if you go to that natural class of trade, that's where we've been the strongest. If you look at the SKU count, like how many products do we have on shelf, you might see on average 95 different SKUs of Organic Valley product in a natural class of trade. And so we have the variety. Anything that's in organic dairy, we can have it. You know, no matter how specialized it is, we have the ability to do that because of our model. Our model was co-processors to drive variety and to drive consumer choice, and that's where we play. If you look at a mainstream retail channel for grocery, you might see our SKU count might be a lot less. In some places, there's only a couple Organic Valley SKUs on the shelf. In some places, it might be a dozen, but it's not going to rival that, 95. And in some cases, on the really high end, you might see over 100, 120 SKUs of Organic Valley products on the shelf. So again, that's what is our calling card about for a consumer? And part of it was about we can do everything that's organic dairy. We're creating that. So if you look at like how we grew, how the Organic Valley grew, and a lot of how the organic dairy industry grew in total was about growing with sort of people who were what I'll call like a true believer, right? People that are like, they're all in on this message of organic and what it means. And that's where, again, growing that natural class of trade, that's your consumer, right? They're coming there not just for the organic dairy, but everything else that kind of fits that mold for them. And so we grew in that space with folks who were really into what we did and dedicated to the approach and very sort of aligned with our philosophy and our belief system, et cetera. And we grew and grew and grew and grew. And I think our founders and the people that helped lead this organization from the early years were really visionary about like where this thing was going to go. And I say this all the time, but if you ran a simulation of 7 farmers in rural Southwest Wisconsin starting a thing with a mission to change the world, like how many times out of 1,000 would that ever work? How many times do you get to an organic company that's $1 billion to the first organic $1 billion brand in the world, the largest organic dairy co-op in the world? This would never happen, right? Maybe you hit that like 3, 4, 5 times out of 1,000. And our founders and those people that started this thing from the beginning, they created that. It's incredible. It's miraculous almost to think about how it worked. But that's how we grew from that, and we were kind of playing in a marketplace with true believers who were like all in on what we did. And as we start to see the market shift and organic to become more mainstream, it's great. You can reach more people, more consumers have access to those kind of products, because that was a really long time that, depending on where you lived, you might not have an option to go to an organic, natural food co-op, for example, to get those kind of products. You might even have access to it. And now, as you start to see more mainstream channels take it up, more consumers in a mainstream kind of arena buying those kind of products, your access goes way up, but sometimes the dedication level or the focus level of any individual consumer might on average go down. Of course, you still have those true believers who are really all in 100% on what we do. That's fantastic. We love those folks. We want as many of those folks as possible to identify with our industry and to help it grow. But there are also folks who might be saying, I'm in my local retail grocery store, whatever that is, and I just want the best thing for my kid. And I have a sense, and sometimes they don't even know why, that if you ask them to define like why they would buy organic, they might not have a really consistent answer across a lot of them. But generally it's like there's some tie back to, I think this is going to be better for my kids, so I'm taking that thing. And they may not know how many farms we have. They may not know the exact definition of organic. They may not know how it stacks up to some other kinds of claims, or is it non-GMO, is it whatever. They may not know the detail of that, but they just know they're trying to get the best possible thing for their family. And so that becomes a different experience though. You've got a consumer who has a different level of focus on your product. So that's a thing that has changed quite a lot, and now that becomes a dominant way that people reach our products is through that mainstream channel. Of course, we still have a really, really fantastic business in the natural class of trade. It's critical to us, but we're reaching consumers in whole new ways. And not just us, but the organic industry in total and the natural food industry in total. Even things that are not even organic, but are making non-GMO claims or other things that, they're trying to reach as many people as possible. And so I think that's, people want to, in general, get to that point where our products are accessible to the most people.
Mm-hmm. So are there any major store chains in the United States right now, grocery, that don't carry at least some organics? Because I remember you go back 15 years ago, like you had to go to a Whole Foods or your local natural store to really get a line of organic products. Now, like all the stuff locally here, all the major grocery store chains, the IGAs, the Walmarts, Aldi, they all have their organic lines. Are there chains that you're still trying to infiltrate and trying to get into that don't carry any organics?
I would say, excuse me, there are very few places where they wouldn't have an organic portfolio, whether they carry a particular brand or not. Tons of places don't carry a wide variety. So they may have OV on the shelf. They might have one of our competitors. They might have a private label product, but they're going to have something organic there. I think if you talk about retail in general, most of them will see a natural and organic shopper as a really, really valuable shopper that they want to have in their store. They want to make sure that they give them a reason to keep coming back. In a lot of cases, not ever give them a reason to leave, to have to go and find a product somewhere else. And they'll see those consumers as being really valuable because they tend to have a higher basket ring. What I mean is they'd have a higher spend per stop at the grocery store. Okay. Right. So
I want you to expand on the basket ring.
Yeah.
Is that what you call that?
Exactly. So when your basket is being rung up at the checkout, your basket ring is what's the dollar spend on average, of that shopper. So if your basket is full of organic products, then you're going to have on average a higher basket ring, a higher average cart value than if you were not buying in the organic class of trade or in the organic food category. So they want that because it's a higher spend per customer. They a lot of times maybe focus on kind of premium products and things that have maybe even a higher margin for that retailer. So they would see that consumer as being really valuable. They want to create a reason for that consumer to show up, and they want to create a reason for that consumer not to have to go anywhere else to get a specific kind of product that they're looking for. Especially the retail chains that are very, very focused on customer loyalty and how do they really do a great job of keeping those folks in store. This will be critically important to them. They don't want to see their shopper leave and go somewhere else to pick up a product that they can't get there if it's really important to them. So, part of part of the story for us or for anybody else who's in this space would be how do you help that retailer understand the data and make a compelling case for why you're going to provide value to the retailer, to the customer, and keep them in the store?
So there's a number of things there. First of all, the basket ring concept of you're spending more on organic products. And I think the one of the perceptions that is out there is that organic is just expensive. And, I guess I'm speaking from the standpoint of an owner of a business that may be looking into the organic realm. Well, that's more expensive. That must mean I can make more money. And we know as that value is supposed to go back to the farmer. That's kind of the idea, part of the idea behind organics. How do you tell that story, first of all, to the consumer and the retailer? That isn't just a basket ring. It's not just a value that is on that shelf, but it's something that's worth something to a farmer.
That's a great question. I think I would actually challenge the entire premise. I think working where we work, we're in a farmer-owned co-op, and not just a farmer-owned co-op, but a farmer-owned co-op with a bunch of folks who decided they're changing the entire economic model of dairy to specifically focus on creating value for the farmer. Now, everyone who's a farmer-owned co-op wants to create value for the farmer, but we did it in a different way and said, we're always going to put the farmer first. Their pay comes first, the co-op piece comes second. And so we, I think, take for granted that the value should be going back to the farmer in a bigger way than maybe a lot of other kinds of organizations. And so I think, that's an internal view that we have, but I don't think that everyone has that same view. And it's certainly when you get to a consumer level or to a different kind of company that would approach this, they don't always try and figure out what's the best way to get maximum value to farmers. Everyone needs to figure out how to have enough value for farmers that the supply chain works, whether you are farmer owned or not. If you're a company that's buying organic from a co-op like ours or directly from farmers or from other space, you need to have them be economically viable. But a lot of organizations, their role primarily is maximizing their own value. So if you're a company that's buying an organic ingredient, whether it's dairy or something else, you might be saying I just want that producer, whether it's a farmer, it's a grower of some sort, to get enough value to stay in business, but I want the biggest share of that value to be with me. And I have to have enough value that the consumer sees it as being valuable, that they'll want to pay for it, but I'm trying to capture the value for me. And from a retailer perspective, they want the value to be at the retailer level. And so there has to be value, of course, at every single step across the supply chain. But I think depending on the kind of organization you are, the split of where you think the most of the value should lie may be really different. There's a lot of folks who want the value just to be in their pocket. They want the biggest share to be in the pocket that they're living in. And that's not necessarily a good or bad thing. That's not our philosophy, but that is just a different way of kind of looking at the world. For us, we want to create as much farm value, and we try and create it on the front end, right? It's the highest pay price that we can possibly give them. And even we'll see it in our own financials. In the last couple of years, it's been more challenging where the co-op is not making nearly as much money maybe as they even were 5 years ago. But if we can keep our pay price right and as high as possible, that's a primary goal for us. That's not the primary goal for most retailers, to have the highest possible farmer pay price. Generally, they want the farmer pay price to be as low as possible while keeping them sustainable. Not because they don't like farmers, but because they want there to be value in other parts of the supply chain that they can tap into. So because our push is different.
That's the easiest way to up your profits, is to cut the price on your supply.
Right.
Which goes back to the farmer. And sometimes I do think we take it for granted because we work with, our goal is to help farmers be profitable, stay in business, keep the family farm going to the next generation. And I know for myself, I take it for granted that people who believe in organics have the same mindset that I do. Well, we've all seen farmers come to organics because of the premium. You're going to have retailers coming to organics for exactly the same reason as the farmer comes, because of possibly more profits. Because if the money is not there, and Brian, we've talked about this, how farmers transition to organics for the money. Not nearly all of them, But once they've been doing it for 3 to 5 years, all of a sudden the mindset changes. But the driving force is still, is there more money there to keep my kids interested in agriculture? So I think this is really good for me to understand that there's a lot of people that don't have the same mindset. We're entrenched in this, all in the same thing. So we need to understand that not everybody is coming at it with the mindset of let's see how much money we can make the farmer. Because
that's definitely an internal kind of facing view. And I don't think there are people out there that just say like, forget those guys, we don't care. Yeah. But generally there's a huge portion of the consumer base that the number one thing they care about is like, is this a healthy product? Is it better for my family than something else? And if it has the added benefit of helping some farmers along the way, that's great. But their primary drive might be about like that thing that they're using to nourish their children or their family's bodies. And it's not a bad thing. It's just that's maybe their primary focus. And so different sets of consumers will be more focused on the environment. Different sets of consumers may be more focused on that sustainable supply chain all the way back to the farm. But yeah, I think that's a view that we often have internally, and we may take it for granted, but I don't think it's universal. I'd say we all have different kind of realizations as we kind of go through our careers. We hit different points. One of the ones for me was really kind of in this line. When I first came to Land O'Lakes, in my career, I was really good at helping to create more profitable products that we could use that value to create value for our consumers, for our company, et cetera. I didn't spend a lot of time thinking about the raw materials that came into my world and creating value for that supply. I always wanted the lowest possible price because that gave me more value that I could share through other parts of the supply chain. And when I came to Land O'Lakes, and when I started talking about, okay, well, how do we get costs down? And of course, you want to get manufacturing costs down. You want to get other kinds of costs down. But when you start talking about the cost of milk down, wow, this became a taboo subject. And of course, living in the organic farmer-owned space that we do, that makes perfect sense. When I first came to the space, it was a very weird scenario to say, oh, I don't want the price of milk to go down so I can create value in other parts of the supply chain. I want the price of milk to be as high as possible. And in very many places in the world, it would be a crazy concept to say, no, I want my cost of goods to be really high, because then you're creating less opportunity for value to come from other places, So it really became a mindset shift to say, okay, how do I make this work differently? And so it's not that you can't still create value. You just have to use different tools to maybe create value. And you maybe need to be more focused on different kinds of innovation. And can you create process savings where that plant runs more efficiently? You want that cost out, but you don't want the cost out of the milk. And so, I think it's a really valid point that you're talking about. Like the mindset that we have is not the same as for everyone else. One of the first things you learn if you're in the marketing world, that if you're doing it right, you have to learn, I am not my customer. I am not my customer. And that doesn't mean that I can't be an example of my customer, but it means I'm not the only version of my customer. So if I make a product that works really great for me and the rest of my consumer base doesn't care about it as much, that may not be maximizing the value that I can generate. If I create the product that appeals to more consumers, that might be more important than even if I don't like the product as much personally. So, an example of this, I don't like coffee. I've never liked coffee. Can't drink coffee. The taste of it just does not work for me at all. And a lot of people think that's crazy, but I don't. And so
it is crazy, by the way.
Well, if I was to say to my team, sorry, we're not going to have a coffee flavored product because I don't personally like it, that would be pretty stupid because there's a huge portion of the population that wants that coffee flavored whatever the item is. And so back to this idea, I am not my customer. Just because I don't like coffee doesn't mean it's not a great product. And the other way is the same thing too. I was talking with somebody who we work with on the supply side about a product they make. And it's another head of sales for their organization. And she said, oh, there's a product that our owner really likes. We can't discontinue it, even though it's not performing as well on the retail shelf as we like. It's the owner's favorite product. She won't let us discontinue it. And we joked about just create it in the test kitchen and make sure she has a constant supply. But you have to have the product that works for your retailer, that works for your consumer. And so this idea of making sure that you have the frame that your consumers have, that your customers have, is really important. And it's easy. I think every company has a tendency to fall back and use their internal lens a lot. But if we want to be the best at creating that maximum value, we got to make sure that we're looking outside of ourselves. And of course, it has to come back to creating value for our co-op and for our members. But if you're not creating value at the consumer and with what they really care about, what's really driving them, then we're going to miss the mark. We're going to miss opportunities where we could have offered a more valuable thing or had something that hit their consumer need in a little bit better way. But I think that's critical for any business, and a lot of businesses will have the same challenge. It's not hard to get self-focused, right? Because most of what you do, like you've got a boss who's telling you like do this thing, and that thing a lot of times is like what is internally right in front of you, and so it's normal.
So you mentioned tools in the toolbox, and you kind of were hitting on innovation as being one of those things, and you're coming at it from a different angle with trying to create, you're looking at a higher cost of goods and trying to keep it higher. So what other tools do you now have in the toolbox, or do you use when you're trying to sell product besides innovation? Sure.
Great question. On the innovation front, I'll come back and revisit that again just for a sec, because I think it's critically important. You talked about having that higher price, and of course we want a high price to support our members, support our co-op, support our retailers, et cetera. But we have to make sure that whatever we're providing also has enough value that consumers see that it's worthwhile to pay for it. I've joked a lot about like some of our great new products where it would just be a normal thing, but we would charge 5 times more for it to create extra value. And the joke being, of course, if the consumer doesn't see value, it doesn't really work. Mm-hmm. And so we have to make sure that what we're doing is something that consumers value, and therefore that value can then flow back through the supply chain. So innovation is a big one, making sure that we understand enough about the trends for where things are going that we can meet the market demand, meet consumers where they're going to be. So we've made a lot of investments in our own team in understanding, data trends, where the market's going to go, and that we can get out ahead of it. There are other tools that we use though that really are to be able to tell a more compelling story, to use data differently than maybe we have in the past. We were an organization, and a lot of folks, especially in the organic space, there's a lot of small players out there that came up, and none of it, at some point in time, none of us had any money. And so we're selling this product based on belief in where this is going to go. But we may not have a lot of data to help tell the story. We may not be able to go out and show, here's 18 market trends that support this thing.
But I have passion behind it. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And that works for a period of time. And at some point, though, as you get bigger and your customers get bigger and they're more sophisticated and we're more sophisticated, that we can use data to tell that story differently. And I'll give you an example on the data side. Part of it is about investing to see where a trend's happening, what flavor profiles are going to happen, what types of products are growing or not growing. The other piece is, what is the actual consumer behavior at retail, and how do we use that story to show where we have value versus competitive products. So, we use a lot of panel data now. We're investing a lot more in panel data and customer side data. So we can see, for example, let's say a major retailer, we can look at all the products that their customers are buying and start to tell them where are they buying it, how are they buying it, and what happens when we see something called leakage. And leakage means something specific in our world. So if you have a retailer who has a customer in the store and they can't get what they want for whatever set of reasons, the product's not there, the price isn't there, the pack size isn't there, whatever. If they leave that store and go somewhere else to buy it, for that retailer, it's leakage. They've had that customer leak out to some other competitor to buy that product. So if we look at a specific retailer and we can say, for example, 4% of the total shoppers that are in your stores buy organic cheese. 4%. It's not a super high number, but that's relatively close to what the market might look like in total for organic cheese. Fluid would be a lot higher, but cheese might be around that 4% number. 4% buy cheese organically. Now, out of those 4%, 19% of your shoppers buy it from you. And they buy whatever set of brands are there. It might be us, might be a competitor, might be private label, but 19% are buying from you. And 81% of them are going somewhere else to buy it. Meaning either you don't have the right price, you don't have the right pack size, you don't have the right brand, you don't have whatever. And we can actually even look at the data to see and here are the primary places they go to buy it that are not your store. These are the competitors. And then we can be able to show at those competitive stores, what are the brands that they're buying, what are the pack sizes they're buying, what price point they're buying at, et cetera. So that data can be a really compelling way to show that retailer, hey, you're losing value. You're having this high value customer that's walking out of your door and getting this somewhere else. Let us show you how to keep them in the store. And that's true not just for us, but for other folks. But we're doing a better job now than we did in the past of investing in that data to be able to tell the story. So we're not creating a story out of thin air. We're not just making up a thing that we want to be true. We can show them the data about what your consumers are actually doing looks like X. The outcome of that X is now Y. And you want that consumer to stay in the store and to be happy with buying it here. Let us help you be part of the solution. Let us show you where we operate there. We can also use data to look at the top selling products that they're in that geography that are not being bought at the store. They're not being carried by that store. So that retailer, we can say the number one thing that people are buying in the organic space, dairy space, that you guys don't carry is whatever. It's might be Organic Valley shredded cheese. You guys don't have it on your shelf. That means these customers have to go somewhere else to buy it. And we can show through the data how loyal our customers are versus other competitors, and see like how can we show that if they carry it, you're going to have a more loyal shopper with us versus someone else. And in some cases, our data is really, really compelling. And in some cases, it's not as compelling. It might be a little bit more average. And in some cases, some people beat us. I mean, there's always going to be folks who have a niche thing that might have a specialty, et cetera. So you don't have to be best at everything. Of course, we want to be best at everything, but you have to be best at every single possible thing. But you go, okay, what is the value? What is the creative, compelling story that we can show you? And back it with data. So, this is not just us making up a thing that we want to be true. It's a thing that's actually verifiably true. You can go check it out independently, and you can see here's where this happens. And again, that's not something that applies just to us, but as companies grow and they get more sophisticated in that space, we've invested more in talent, we've invested more in data, and there's a lot of folks that they may want to go the same direction, right? And they get access to that same data. They may be able to tell a really compelling story, whether they're selling organic coconut milk, whether they're selling organic ginger snaps, could be anything, right? That data helps make your story more powerful. Well, and that's an important tool.
I'm going to do what you said not to do and make myself, I'm my own customer.
Yeah.
And, in my world, I go to Trader Joe's for a certain thing, and then I go to Earth Fare for a different thing, and Meijer for a different thing. And I've got a rotation of probably 5 different stores that I have certain products that I go to purchase. How do you know that I'm doing that, first of all? And then how do you present that?
I want to know that too, because I'm conspiracy theorist. Like, I don't have any reward cards because you don't need to know what I'm doing. So
but there's
where
enough
does this
people
come
that do.
from?
But how do you get that kind of data?
There's a lot of mini drones that just follow you around that you don't even.
I knew it.
This is going to be the most sad little drone following me around.
Well, so I think it's a great question. So let me tell you, of all those stores you mentioned, every single one of them want you not to go to the other stores you mentioned. Yep. They want you to just find everything you need in their store. Now, certain folks, the retailer may have a specific focus to say, hey, we're going to focus on, a smaller assortment of stuff that's really high moving. And so they know they're going to lose you for certain kind of specialty products, but they all have a philosophy for how they want to kind of create value for customers, but they also want you to get everything from their store. They'd be really happy if you didn't shop at any of those other places. And that kind of goes back to the idea of how do you create this compelling story to show them the value of, so some of the stories you mentioned, just pick any one of them. I'll let you pick, since I don't want to like name a retailer, since these guys might be our customers or not, but it's
Earth Fare.
So if you're at Earth Fare, that they would love you to spend all the money that you're spending at any of those other outlets. They'd love it if all those dollars were spent at Earth Fare instead. Mm-hmm. So they want to create enough value to keep you there.
I know, but they don't have what I want.
Well, and that's the story that we want to tell. That's the story that all the folks who are trying to get on the shelf at those retailers would say, let us prove to you that, we can keep him in store if we have the right assortment.
So how do you find out what Brian's buying at the other stores and go back to Earth Fare, just as an example, and show them that Brian's buying, organic pinto beans over here because you don't have them? Where do you get that data to show them?
So I would say I tend to leave company names out of this stuff.
Yeah.
So not give free advertising to all these guys, but there's some really, really great data panels that exist that track that consumers participate in. They incentivize consumers to participate and share their information, and then they use that to build a portfolio for the broader kind of populace.
And that's really all that's what I kind of figured.
Yeah, they won't know Brian's specific habits about pinto beans and where they're shopping for them, et cetera. But they'll be able to say, of all the people that fit this kind of profile, that these are the things they're buying. Here's where they get bought, because the data exists for for where that transaction happens. That all exists. There's a bunch of companies that compile all that data that can show you the market share of any given company, any given category across whatever the retail platform is going to be. So that kind of stuff is pretty normal. That's the kind of data that retailers and CPG companies have been using forever to say, here's our market share in a certain kind of segments or et cetera. Now the data is getting more detailed now, and I think the panels that are doing a really good job and the data providers are doing a really good job make it as easy as possible for consumers. So at a certain point in time in the old days, people would have to come home, basically record the information, all the items that came out of their grocery bag. They would record it, documents it, and then that's how you'd look at building a profile. You'd have thousands of those people that say, okay, here's what I bought this week. It's the same kind of way that's like the Nielsen ratings for TV. They'd ask people basically to kind of track what they're watching. And again, the technology for how they do it so much better now. But to track, like, what did you watch? And way back in time, people are writing it down and sending it in, like, this is what I watched. And that's how they can tell how much the shows should be charging for advertising, because they sample a certain portion of the population. They say this portion of the population watched this show, and that's where you want that demographic to pay attention to your product, pay more for advertising, pay less for advertising, et cetera. So these companies, they'll incentivize customers. They'll give them rewards to document all the things they're buying. Now, some of that data became pretty flawed just for certain kind of product types and the way that people consume them. So, for example, in the kind of candy or snack space, there's tons of products that would never get unpacked from that bag when you got home, because that product got drank or eaten on the way home, got eaten in the car. So if you had a candy bar, that product, you may never pull it out of the bag and see it. So if you're in like the Hershey Mars kind of end of the world, the data that you'd see from consumer panel would show that you should only be selling maybe like 50% or 75% of what you actually see your sales being. And it's because people aren't tracking that product very effectively, because a lot of the way they consume it doesn't match with the way that they collect the data. So there's now a lot better ways. So there's folks who basically, you can come home and just with your smartphone snap a picture of your receipt, and they have the algorithms to basically go through and say, okay, I can take all those receipt items and their price points and translate it back into pack size, et cetera, and have a much more complete and robust data picture than people recording what they bought. And so there's a lot of different ways that the technology has advanced to make it easy and to make the data much more reliable than it used to be. You mentioned, Mike, that you don't have reward cards because you don't want people knowing what you're doing, right? My wife is kind of in this boat. She doesn't want people tracking her. She doesn't want people knowing things. She doesn't want to fill out anything so that people can pay attention to what's happening. Now, the trade-off in that is, you miss out on the rewards. And there are organizations that do a really great job of using those reward setups, and there's others that don't focus on it very much at all. The ones that do it at a really elite level. So Kroger's maybe an industry-wide example of somebody who does a killer job of using their reward card, right? So they have about 97% of all purchases that happen at Kroger and Kroger stores will be on a rewards card. They've done a really, really good job over time of creating value. So the way that they communicate back with folks, the way that they run special promotions that apply to them, they can really kind of customize the kind of offers, based on what your purchase habits are. They've done a really good job of showing customers and consumers that there is value in sharing that information. They've made it worthwhile for people to want to participate in that way. They're kind of an industry icon, I think, as far as like their ability to do that well. I mean, it's to the point that they kind of joke that the other 3% are basically vacation shoppers. If you're on vacation, you've gone to an area that has a Kroger store that you don't normally shop at, that's the only place that they're not getting that consumer data. And so they want to make it worthwhile. Mm-hmm. And, I think that, again, there's varying degrees of who's been successful at this or not. But if they can do a good job of recommending other things you're going to like, and do a good job of making sure that you're getting coupons or promotions on the products that you care about, the categories that you care about, and they create value, you go, okay, it's worthwhile to let these guys track me. And I think there's lots of folks who don't think about it at all. Anybody can track me anywhere. It's kind of like where we've got in our society that data privacy is, getting more attention now, but still a lot of us give away a lot of our data all the time without thinking about it. There's some folks who say, I'm really going to make sure it has to be worth it. Almost everybody will have some kind of program that they participate in, and they go, this is worthwhile enough. This reward is beneficial enough, whether it's a frequent flyer program, a credit card reward program, whatever that different thing is. There's some categories where you go, okay, even though I don't really want people tracking me, this one's worth
Fine,
it. I
fine.
get enough
This is-
reward on this thing. Yeah.
But you know what? I have never heard of somebody who became a multimillionaire because of reward points.
I don't know if those people exist. Actually, I don't know about multimillionaire, but there's a blog, now it's a site called The Points Guy. And this is a person who started their career. They had a whatever regular job, and they were aficionado for like rewards programs, points, especially on the airfare side. And they started writing about it. They created the blog. Now they've got a site. And I don't know multimillionaire or not, but that's a career now.
So now my joke just got shot down because there's actually somebody making a living off of rewards points.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And they exist. I pay more attention to that one because I spend a lot of time in airplanes, and in my old life especially, I spent even more in airplanes. So it was a source of information for me. It's something that pops up in my newsfeed quite a bit because I read a lot of stories that kind of are in this space around like how do you maximize the rewards that you're doing while you have to spend time away. Whether that's, again, hotel points, rewards points, cars, lots of different things. Everybody's got something that they say, okay, this is where it's valuable enough for me to share my data. And for some people, it's Facebook. For some people, it's whatever, But there's lots of spaces, I think, that people aren't very specific about, like data privacy. And on the shopping side, again, if you create enough value, it's a good thing. There's a reward card that I have that I feel like I'm using it now. I keep every time I punch in the number, I'm like, I'm not sure if I'm actually getting anything of value out of this. I'm not sure if this is valuable enough. Somebody's getting this data. I don't see the value, but it's a specific thing from like where I've recently moved. And I feel like I thought maybe it's going to be valuable to me. It's not transparent to me that there's enough value that I keep doing this. So at some point, maybe I'm just going to stop. I think that for somebody like, I'll just go back to this Kroger example because they're such widely recognized in the industry for doing it right. They are able to create value because they have something called My Magazine, which they can tailor to your specific purchase habits. So if you and Brian live on the same street, you might actually get a different version of the My Magazine. Like the core information that's in there might be the same, but the coupons that are in might be different. Some of the specific articles that are in there might be different. And they're able to create value for you guys separately by knowing enough about what you care about and your purchase habits have told you to say, okay, Mike really wants to, see articles that are about like high-end foods and like really fancy, like creative culinary experiences that he can create at home. And maybe Brian wants something that's like all about convenience and how do I get like grab and go stuff that fits my lifestyle because I'm never in my house. I'm like outside hiking 20 hours a day, whatever it is. So they can individually customize that, and you receive the value of them actually knowing enough about you, and they're transferring that value back to you, not just using the value for themselves. So again, various organizations do this to varying degrees of success. And I'll just use Kroger just because, again, they're a widely recognized example of this. But if they create enough value, then you go, okay, cool. I'm going to keep using my rewards card and it's going to pay off. Versus this other thing that I'm talking about where every time, again, that I use that card, I'm like, I'm not totally sure what I'm getting out of it. And I think a lot about data and how this impacts, consumer experience. I'm like, I don't know that I'm getting anything of value. Should I just stop? That's not, they're not doing a great job.
For somebody like me who's kind of anti-rewards points or don't put stuff in my feed just because I was watching it. When you see an ad or something that interests you, you're like, oh, cool, that's kind of neat.
Right.
And you grudgingly admit that it's kind of neat and it's really helpful. But I totally understand why Kroger's doing that, because they are creating a very loyal, or not just Kroger, but that style of reward, but that is creating a loyal customer, a loyal consumer. It's to me, it's a little bit scary because I'm a conspiracy theorist to the bone. But it's really interesting to hear. You're talking about all the data that you're using, and it's this exact thing, and it's very helpful in your field. Yeah,
absolutely. And it's I think can be helpful just for a regular consumer, right? If I look at my Google Newsfeed, so on the app that I use on my iPhone, the Google Newsfeed is there because whenever I open up, I'm searching for something. It's got a set of news stories that are there. A lot of NBA stories there. I'm a huge NBA fan. That's good for me. If they were showing lots of baseball stories, that would be bad news. I would be skipping it. Would not be valuable, right? So that's just my personal preference. I'm a huge basketball fan. I want to see those things. I click on a lot of NBA stories. NBA stories keep coming for me. Also, I'm a politics junkie, and so I am paying attention to lots of stuff that's happening there. The algorithm can get it wrong, right? So I started realizing kind of recently that I was seeing lots and lots of stories that show up that say, some person's name in the Senate, in hot water over a thing, right? And I'd be like, I don't recognize that name. That looks really interesting. And you click it, and it turns out it's like the Senate in a country that might be in a different part of the world that I may not be paying a lot of attention to. So if it's like the Senate in Ghana, I'm like, well, why in the world? But it turns out there was like one reference to a U.S. senator, and this is the Senate in Ghana. It's because I looked at a lot of stories that are involved the Senate. Apparently, I'm getting now stories about the Senate that have nothing to do with what I'm actually interested in. So the algorithm's a little wrong. And so then I have to go in and say, like, I'm not interested in stories about the Ghana Senate. And so that hopefully gets better. Now, I used to not ever go and click those stories. I would just skip it. But I'm like, God, these things keep showing up. I'm sick of seeing this story that's not relevant to me. And now I'll actually take the second to go in and be like, not interested in that, or I'm not interested in that news source as the outlet. If it's the Rajasthan Times, probably not a whole lot of articles from them that's really going to be relevant to me. Like, I've been to Rajasthan. I think it's an interesting part of the world. That's not generally the story that I want showing up when it's about something that's happening in the government there in India. And so I try to be a little careful to go actually, I may want to know something about what's happening in this thing with Indian politics. So I don't want to just cut it out completely, but I want to make sure that I'm not getting a story that's not relevant. So this happens in our everyday life in certain ways. And so I like the fact that the Google app is figuring out what I want to see when it's showing me NBA stories. And I get unhappy when they're showing me stuff that I don't want to see in other areas. So it's, it can be commercially important for folks in my industry, but also just personally important. Now, it's commercially important to the people who are selling ads to Google.
Well, fortunately for Google, you don't have many other options for searching and an app on your phone. But then we're tying it back to a dairy product, there are plenty of other options that if you're not there in front of them with the right thing at the right time and the right place and everything, there will be another thing that is right next door at a better price sometimes, or doesn't even matter. It's there. They can get it.
Absolutely. And I think that's, especially when you start talking about the natural and organic food space, and sometimes even the conventional food space, but people who want to appeal to those natural organic consumers, you get into some tricky areas, right? Because you've got folks that will make claims that, somebody who's a kind of purist, we're purists, right? We're the crazy people that actually sue the government to enforce the rules more, versus trying to figure out ways to get around them and skirt the rules. And so
to get rid of our own loopholes.
Exactly. So we don't want to use loopholes. We don't want anyone else using them against us. So we want the loopholes to be closed. That's not a very normal approach for a lot of businesses. But, so that's where I say, we're kind of purists in this space. We want people, if they say a thing, to mean it. So I even think if there's a competitor of ours who's making a claim that's valid, that pushes us to kind of be better at what we do too. But if people are making claims that we don't consider to be valid, that's the thing that makes us crazy. And we always want to make sure consumers, there's the highest level of integrity in what they think they're getting for what's going on there. And I think there's some of these tools can actually make it easy though to, using certain kinds of keywords, and especially keywords that don't have a legal definition or a regulatory definition, that can get people to say, oh, maybe I'm interested in that. That might be an interesting thing. And so, that's a tricky space for us to kind of work around, right? So we as we talk about kind of greenwashing, people who would make claims that maybe would lead folks to believe certain things that may not be accurate. There's a competitor of ours, again, we'll leave the names off, but a competitor of ours who does a really nice job in driving that business that they're in. And if you poll their consumers, so we've done the data, we've done the research to say what percentage of their consumers think that it's an organic product, and it's over 80% think it's an organic product. It's not organic. They don't make any organic claims specifically, but the positioning, the language, the way that the images that they use are specifically kind of targeted at having this have the look and feel of a natural organic product, even though it's not. And in fact, if you go 2/3 of the way down their FAQ page, when it says, are you organic? It'll say, no, we're not organic, but we think we're better than organic. And here's why. And they've got a little description of that. And so we would say, oh, that's a greenwash claim because we have a lot of, belief in what the organic seal means and what that represents. And we want consumers to know they can trust it when they think a thing is organic. So if you've got folks who are basically trying to position that space, even though they're not, that can be tricky. Now, I'm sure that those folks would say, oh, we really believe that we are as good as organic, and here's why. We think that this thing that we do is, equally merits us to what like an organic claim might be. Not that we're making the same claim, but we think there's just as much value in whatever the claims that they would want to make or the way that they operate. So, we would tend to push back on that idea and say, like, if you're kind of positioning yourself as organic, then you should really be organic, or you shouldn't kind of position it in the same way. Maybe you should use different language, etc. It's also tricky because those tools can be used in ways that a lot of consumers, if they think about it, won't like it. But we tend not to think about it, So if you're on a search engine, whether it's a search engine like Google or something else, or if it's a search engine within a specific retail site, if you use a term in the industry called conquesting. If you conquest someone else's search terms or their name or their brand, you can essentially pay to have your product show up when people search for something else, right? So if you've got a product, it's
okay. That just sounds screwed up.
Yeah. Well, if you've got a product that's like it's Mike's Organic Milk, and I want to have my product show up when people are searching for your product because I think my product's better, I might pay to use that terminology. Now, the search engines generally want to not let you use the specific brands as much, and they can even penalize that. But I can use the same language that you use to describe your product for Jim's Special Milk. And even though I may not be making an organic claim, I might use the same sort of search terminology, and I can conquest your sort of searches to make sure that my product shows up when people are looking at your product. Now, from a consumer perspective, there are places where this makes sense, right? That I have a great product and maybe it's Jim's Organic Milk. Maybe it's identical in every way, shape, or form, but my farmers get paid more and I've offered it for a cheaper price. And I would legitimately want my those customers to know that I exist and to have a reason to buy from me. And maybe it's actually better. So the search engines, again, whether it's inside of an e-commerce site or whether it's on just a regular search engine, have some reason to let people do that. To say, okay, well, especially for brands that are gigantic or big companies who can dominate the market, if they just spend all the money on the search terms, then they might keep people from ever knowing that Jim's Organic Milk exists. And everyone's going to Mike's because they don't even know that I exist. So there's rationale for why it might work. Now, if you're on the flip side of that, especially when there might be a big company who's spending a lot of the money to conquest your search, then it can feel pretty rotten. And I think consumers generally wouldn't like that if they stopped to think about it very much, but they do want to have the ability to be exposed to new products, new types of experiences, et cetera. I mean, especially when you talk about millennials, millennials take a lot of flack over a lot of stuff, but one of the things that's actually really interesting, I think, for millennial consumers is that they're really into trying new things. They want to be having a lot of new kinds of experiences. They don't want to just be loyal to one specific kind of product, brand, et cetera. So those search engines or those e-commerce sites might be saying, hey, I'm helping the consumer have a better experience by giving them the variety that they're looking for to make sure that they don't just see the same thing that they always buy. And so it's a tricky spot. Like, I have pretty mixed emotions about this. I mean, I don't like, it seems crazy to me that, if you're not an organic product, you could search that, you could pay for the term organic, whatever, it's organic coconut cookies. And you search that, you buy that term, whoever the actual organic coconut cookie maker is probably pretty ticked off that their product isn't showing up first, that you might be showing up first just because you've spent money to put your product there. And if you're not an organic coconut cookie, if you are, great, part of the competition. But if you're not, you're just a conventional cookie that wants to be on the radar of those same people who would have bought an organic cookie, that can feel pretty rotten. You don't like it. So I don't know what the right answer is at the end of the day, because I can see why there's merits to saying, okay, other things will show up. We can't only let certain companies have access to those search terms, et cetera. But it doesn't feel good to me that you can buy a term that actually isn't representative of what your product is to try and get consumers to pay attention to it. Because I think for consumers, a lot of folks assume, like, if it shows up at the top of the search, if it's on an e-commerce site, if it's on our search engine, if I type in, I'm looking for organic coconut cookies, the first thing that pops up, if it's there, I might just go and put it immediately in my basket. I'm assuming, as a consumer, that if I search organic,
that was exactly what you were searching for,
that it's actually going to be organic. But if it turns out it's only non-GMO and I really wanted organic, I might be disappointed later if I find out. Or I might be super happy because it was the best freaking coconut cookie that I've ever seen. And I'm okay that it's non-GMO instead of organic because it turned out to be great. So again, there's two sides of this thing. I don't know which one wins out, but especially if you're in the space where you really are fighting for the integrity of what these words mean and consumers should get what they think they're getting. If that thing shows up at the top of the list and it's not really what it claims, what the person searched, yeah, it doesn't feel great.
So one question I have on the marketplace is, how do you combat natural? Because natural is such a broad term with really very little, not a governing body behind it, but really no rules or regulations behind it.
Support.
Yeah, that's true.
Support behind it. Like that is the broadest term in the natural, well, there I use the word natural, sector of grocery, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because there's really not much behind it.
Well, I think what you're trying to articulate there is that there's no regulatory definition for the word natural.
Exactly. Thank you.
Yeah. So I think if you kind of look historically, what you saw is folks making claims about natural, and then even some of the bigger companies saying, well, that natural, it's pretty broad. I think that I can justify why my product is natural. And companies putting that out there. And there's a couple organizations that really got good and specialized at suing companies who use natural claims and saying, prove it. We're going to make you prove it. We're going to put you through the ringer. And if your version of why you think it's natural doesn't pass muster, then we're going to sue you like crazy and you're going to give us a bunch of money. And so they would have suits like for consumer, I'm going to get the terminology a little wrong here, but basically like false advertising to consumers, that they think they're getting one thing, but they're not. And so what you saw is a lot of the big companies stopped using that because those guys don't go sue the little company that's like operating out of their garage, because there's not a lot of benefit of that.
There's nothing to get.
Even if they think the
win.
claim is wrong, they're not getting any money out of it. So the firms that are doing this kind of like contingent kind of like legal suit, they're not going after those guys, right? So the big companies, I think, in large part, stopped using or really dialed it back or tried to specify what they meant by natural. They might try to make other kinds of claims that they can like more easily define, even if whether or not it has a regulatory definition or not, if they can say, here's why this thing is representative of the claim that I'm making. So especially for little guys, it's not to say that there's not any enforcement around it, but it's a lot harder to get enforcement on little companies that are not changing the market, because the consumers aren't suing them because there's no money in it, and the regulatory agencies in large part are also going after like who's the biggest, who has the most impact if they're not getting it right. And the little guys sometimes are just like pretty far down the prioritization list if they're not getting it exactly right. So, I think that you're correct in saying natural gets used a lot. It doesn't mean anything, or it doesn't mean something that has a definition that can be universally agreed on. It doesn't have a regulatory definition. So how do you combat it? I mean, for us, what we try to do is basically say, here is specifically what we are claiming, and here's the definition of it. I mean, it's pretty straightforward. Like, organic means something from a regulatory perspective. Now, if you ask 10 consumers on the street to define organic, you're probably going to get 9.5 different answers at least, because some people will talk more about the environmental impact. Some people will talk about no pesticides. Some people talk about non-GMO. Some people talk about no hormones. Some people talk about
some people will say it's the natural way of farming.
Yeah, so you got a lot of different ways to describe organic, and all of those things would be correct, right? So organic is in a tricky spot because it means a lot of things. It's a really complicated designation, but it means something specific. So we talk about organic because it means something specific. It's, you're not going to get sued for false advertising over organic if you have an organic certified product. Now, if you made a natural claim on something that was certified organic, someone still might want to sue you over it. I don't know, but you'd still be pretty justified, I think, in making that kind of claim. But if we talk about the organic piece, not a lot of areas where this could get gray, and people could be like, well, if you said organic, we weren't sure if you really meant organic. When we talk about grass-fed, we use that terminology to mean something specific. We talk about it to mean 100% grass-fed, no grain ever. That's what it means. And we have we partnered with even our competitors to create this 100% grass-fed seal that we don't own it. They don't own it. It's publicly available. That certification can be audited by any of the auditing agencies that would come and certify your product organic or something else. Say specifically, it has a definition now. Before, when people say grass-fed, well, does that mean that they're grass-fed 90% of the time? 95, 80, 75? Like, where's the cutoff? Do
they walk through a field once a year?
Yeah, well, as long as they still need to take a bite of the grass, right? But we said, okay, this needs to have more integrity so that consumers, when they buy this thing, they get what they think they're getting. It isn't just, well, they're out most of the time or some of the time or even 95% of the time. We said, no, should mean 100. If we say grass-fed, we mean this. So that's the kind of was part of the origin for the 100% grass-fed seal that we developed with competitors. Again, part of the reason we don't own it, somebody can say, well, you're just doing this to self-serve. Like, no, this is attainable for anybody. Anybody can go and pursue this as long as they actually can back it up and do the things that come with that grass-fed certification. So you combat it, I think, by making specific claims that you know have merit. Now, it's pretty hard to kind of get consumers to understand a thing that may not be at the top of their priority list or may be complicated. So combating it can be tough. It can be expensive, and sometimes it's not as fruitful as you want it to be. But I think the best way you combat it is to make specific claims that are verifiable and easy to understand. Because if you make claims that are hard to verify, that's tough. If you make claims that consumers don't understand or don't want to think about, that can be tough. So you kind of make it relevant to the consumer.
But I think that's a little bit, being transparent to the consumer as well. Like, this is who we are. This is what we're doing. This is why we're doing it. We believe this is going to make the product better. And there's responsibility to doing it the right way. So I really like the grass-fed seal. I also like the organic is always non-GMO, things like that. So
absolutely,
I think there's a lot of exciting things happening with certain seals. Right now, it's a little bit hard to navigate sometimes with all the different claims, but I believe in definitely in the organic seal right now.
And that kind of leads to, I think we'll start to wrap it up here. But one last question would be, we talked as you're trying to sell product, innovation, data, making claims, and when you make what we're talking about when making claims, organic, grass-fed, it's all on-farm practices. And I think one thing that I want to make sure we talk about is as you're trying to move product, what on-farm practices are things that retailers and customers actually care about?
I think part of the challenge here is that there's not one consumer,
where
profile
can
that
a
you're trying to
farmer
meet. Yep.
improve their farm in order to meet that organic value is trying to move a product at a premium price?
Yeah.
Where can a farmer help to improve, and where are the priorities?
Well, so when I say that there's not one set of consumer preference, I mean that I don't mean that it's unimportant or that you can't tackle it. I just mean that certain messages are going to appeal to certain consumer sets. I think that at the end of the day, most of the consumers who are buying in this organic space or natural and organic space, if they're buying non-GMO, et cetera, they're trying to solve consumer needs that fall into one of a couple buckets, right? Some people will be focused on an environmental impact. Some people will be focused on animal welfare. Some people will be focused on health. Some people will be focused on keeping bad stuff out, like a kind of no list versus a positive list. The way that I tend to think about consumers in a space like ours is that you've got, and it's normally moms. It can be a gender-specific thing to say moms, but moms still in this country do a lot of the shopping and food choice for their families. So it's not just moms, but a lot of times it is moms who are making the call on this to say, I want this thing that's going to nourish my family, and I want it to be the highest quality. I want it to be safe, and they would have a sense, that whether it's organic or natural or non-GMO or whatever specific kind of claims they're looking for, they kind of meet that. And so if I kind of go backwards in through the supply chain, they go, okay, the choice is for my family, and what makes the impact to being healthier, safer, whatever those things are. So when I think about like a dairy product as an example, they tend to carry that back to animal welfare. So a happy and healthy and well-maintained, well-cared for cow is going to produce the highest quality dairy that I'm going to use for the stuff that's going to go into nourishing my family. So again, kind of take that one more step back. And we talk a lot about farmers from our perspective. I think sometimes consumers make that connection, sometimes they don't. Some consumers will care more or less about the farmer who's at the beginning of that story. We think we've got a really compelling story about the way that we farm with the super small, from an industry perspective, herd size. 75 cows. Most of our owners will see every animal every day. They see them personally. They have a connection to that animal to make sure that the animal welfare is at the highest level that it can be, especially in organic where there's no antibiotics allowed to be used. If you ever get to the point where a cow is sick enough that they need antibiotics, you can, of course, give the cow the antibiotics to make sure they're healthy, but you can't milk them organically anymore. They might have to go into conventional herd. They might have to go into something else. So they have an incentive to create the least stress for that cow possible to make sure that they will stay healthier. So that piece, I think not everyone takes it all the way back to the farm, but they think of the farm practice. How do you make sure that that cow has the best possible life as they're producing this incredibly nourishing thing that's going to take care of my family? So I think it's really about that. Like, how do we tell the story of the care that our members give to their animals that produce this incredible thing that we consume and that nourish us? And I think Organic Valley is in a pretty cool space there because the authenticity that we've built over the course of 30 years, being the real pioneers in this industry, always fighting for tougher standards, tougher regulations, making sure that there's integrity in the claims that are happening. Our story is really authentic. And every major company in the world is striving for authenticity. It's something consumers we can see through in many cases, not all, unfortunately, but in many cases, we can see through the sort of posers that are out there, and they've got a story that they think we want to hear, but there's not the authenticity that's behind it. And so, we have this authenticity that's really hard to match. And that's why you see so many big companies gobbling up these little companies. They can't go and create from scratch the authenticity that comes from those companies that they're purchasing. And that doesn't mean those little companies that are now called big companies lose their authenticity. In some cases they do, and that stinks. But in some cases, the big companies have done a good job of letting them remain autonomous enough that their authenticity can stay intact, even if it's a little different than maybe it was before. But that authenticity is really, really critical. That does come back, I think, too, to like what do consumers want and how do you help people see that's there. And it also it ties then to like how long can you keep that trust in your authenticity? Because if you've got this incredible authenticity that's there, or it's perceived authenticity, if you do something to break that trust, it might be gone forever. So there are folks that are out there that have been telling a really good story, and then all of a sudden a video shows up that shows something that's not consistent with the story they've been telling, and that authenticity might be out the window. You might never get it back. You might be able to manage it. You might be able to kind of spin it and talk about like it was a one-time thing, or this doesn't represent us, or whatever. But sometimes when you lose that authenticity, you never get it back, which is one of the reasons it's critically important to make sure that everything we do carries that authenticity forward. We have this spirit of transparency that even as a person who loves it, coming from the outside, when I first got here, I was sometimes blown away and surprised and sometimes nervous. Like, wow, can we really be that transparent? I'm not sure what this might look like. And I'll give you a story about like transparency and how we think about it and how other people think about it. We had at Natural Expo West last year, as part of our booth, we had this gigantic screen that was up in the booth, and we were doing this thing that we call FaceTime a Farmer. And so we had live feeds set up to multiple farms around the country, and we would go for 30 or 45 minutes at a time to a specific farm and have the farmer live answering questions from people that could walk up. So you can walk up to the booth, see this thing, and be like, what is going on here? And have someone say, do you want to ask that farmer a question? And then you can ask them anything like, how's the weather like there? And you look around. You go, or how many cows do you milk? Oh, at our farm, we milk Jerseys, and we milk 75 cows that are here. Oh, like it looks like you've got some calves. Yeah, that calf was born yesterday. You can like have that live conversation that's there. And we do that with multiple farmers around the country so that we can keep the farmer while they're trying to do their day job. They can go do it without having to spend 10 hours on FaceTime. Well, the CEO of a major food company that everyone in the U.S. would know comes up to our booth and is fascinated by this thing. And he asked one of the folks in our booth, how can you possibly do that? What if something happens that you can't control? What if they say something that's wrong that somebody's going to get offended about? Like, how can you possibly take the risk of having people talk live to the supply chain that you're driving? And the answer back was, we're super transparent. We're incredibly authentic. We have so much trust in our members that we know that we can put them live on screen and have them answer questions in an authentic way. And maybe they'll say something that's not exactly right. It's a little inelegantly phrased, whatever. But the authenticity is there, gives us a lot of credibility to have that conversation openly and frankly. And this CEO was blown away. It's like, I could never do this in my supply chain. And the person in our booth, like pretty boldly, maybe too boldly, was like, yeah, and that's why you'll never be us. Right? And so very, but that's also part of our authenticity. Yeah. That's who we are. And so that's the thing that we, I think really sets, brands like ours apart. Now, we're not the only authentic brand that's out there. There's tons of authentic brands that we work with, tons of them that we don't work with, some that we're competitors with, and they may be frenemies of ours because we want to grow the entire organic space, even if we have this weird thing where we can even be happy for other people growing in the space if it helps the overall picture get bigger, even if they're a competitor. That's not a normal thing in a lot of parts of the world, but that's how we operate. And that authenticity really is kind of incredibly valuable to us in telling that story of what do consumers care about. So in the broader picture, it's all about how do you create value. We talked about this a lot kind of in the beginning part of the podcast, that creating value is for consumers, it's for the companies and co-ops, it's all the way back to the supply chain. We just happen to have a specific view about where most of that value should lie. And for us, it's back to our membership, it's back to our farmers. And we have an incredibly important task to tell the story of why those things matter enough that consumers want to pay enough to support those farmers. But that's what we do. That's our life here. And I know that everybody in this co-op is pretty pumped about that. We don't do this just for fun. We do it because we believe in what we do. And there's a lot of other companies in the organic space that do the same thing. And that's part of the reason that we celebrate them, even with their kind of frenemies, right? Even if they're competing with us in certain spaces. When we grow the categories, when we grow the pie, we do have a belief that that's better for all of us.
Sinking, or what is it? A rising tide raises all boats is
that's our hope anyway.
Yep.
That's our hope.
Yep. Well, Jim, I really appreciate the time. It was really interesting talking to you. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jim. Really enjoyed this.
Well, I think you guys can tell I have a lot of passion for this thing. It comes through. And if anyone wants to nerd out and talk about organic dairy, this is a good spot to do it. So thanks for the opportunity to come and share this conversation, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Back to the Roots podcast, brought to you by Albert Lee Seed.